Good afternoon, Salt Lake City. Welcome to episode 23 of Talk with Ted, a show about nothing. My name is Ted McBride. I'm a lawyer here in Salt Lake City, transplanted New Yorker, and if you've heard me before, you probably know that, but I gotta say it again. You're listening to 1640 AM K-Talk Radio, and I'm here with my good friend Alan Anderson, and we've got a bit of a... I don't know what to call it today. A little bit of a hacked up show. I don't have a guest today, so you're going to be hearing from me for the most part. I'm going to be jumping around, talking about this, that, and the other thing. We may take a few calls. But before I get started, something caught my eye on the way into the studio today. The owner of this station is a gentleman named Dick Perry, who's owned the station for a long time, I think 30 or 40 years, and Dick is a wonderful, wonderful guy. Yeah, that's a little better sound, Alan. And Dick has got some inspirational things throughout the studio, including some U.S. Constitution plaques, some beautiful pictures, and he's got a mission statement here. And I read the mission statement and thought, well, what the heck am I doing on this program if this is the mission statement? But here you have the K-Talk mission statement. We find our world is in a struggle, a war between truth and falsehood. Our mission is to motivate our listeners, employees, and the community to act to preserve the values of decency and morality, liberty and freedom that are increasingly being eroded and lost. Our tools are the truth and the airways. Truth is that which emanates from divine providence, which inspires, uplifts, and directs our thoughts and actions to the benefit and emancipation of mankind. So that's our mission statement here, but I won't guarantee you that I will live up to that today. Again, little self-conscious looking at that, Alan. That's a little bit of heavy pressure.
That is pressure.
But I don't have too many original thoughts to share today, but I've got a lot of quotes I'm going to read. But before we get to that, I got to throw in a little bit of basketball.
Definitely.
What happened to the Utah Jazz on Sunday night?
I don't know. That was not pretty.
It was not pretty. They were crushed by the Houston Rockets. They play again tonight, so maybe there'll be a little chance for redemption. But our beloved Utah Jazz looked terrible the other night.
Yeah.
They looked slow, sluggish, non-urgent, with the exception of Quinn Snyder, the coach, who always looks like he's about to have a heart attack. Did I tell you I was at the game a couple of weeks ago? The Jazz were winning by 30, and Quinn Snyder is going crazy on the sideline, and my 11-year-old daughter said, he's winning by 30.
Your 11-year-old calls him out.
He's winning by 30.
Wow.
But what a fantastic coach they have, and hopefully the team can get some of the enthusiasm that the coach exhibits every night and do a little better. But they look sluggish. It's the playoffs. It's time to dive for the ball, to throw your body around, to play a bit with control, recklessness. And boy, they just didn't look like that the other night.
No.
And too many turnovers for the Jazz. I think they had 20 turnovers to 11 assists, and that's a terrible recipe for trying to win a playoff game.
Oh, yeah.
So they got to figure out a way to stop the great James Harden and to beat the Houston Rockets, because they're beatable.
Yeah, they are.
Especially by this great team. And I've got one issue. A couple of weeks ago, I went to another game, and Grayson Allen, the rookie from Duke, lit him up. Scored 24-25 points, including 16 or 17 points in a 6 or 7 minute stretch. I forgot to turn my phone off. But just an incredible run by Grayson Allen. And then in the final game of the regular season, Grayson Allen scored 40 points. And then I didn't see him last night in the game until the very end, until sort of garbage time. So I think they got to utilize Grayson Allen a little bit more.
Yeah.
And we've got to see more hustle out of the Jazz, and some better ball movement, and some better teamwork and control, because they just looked like they were standing around. They were flustered, of course. The Rockets are great at switching defenders.
Yeah, they are. On
the pick and roll, and they're great at that, and hopefully Quinn Snyder can come up with some insights on how to tackle that. But after the show, I know what I'm doing.
We're going to watch the Jazz game.
I'm going to go plant myself in front of the TV and watch the Jazz game. The NBA too. There's some. I don't know if I'm just getting old, but the NBA I think is struggling with some marketing and trying to generate some interest in the game. I don't see the rivalries that once existed. When I was growing up, of course, it was the Lakers and the Boston Celtics was the great rivalry.
Right.
The Knicks had a great rivalry with several teams, including the Celtics, the Indiana Pacers, back when Reggie Miller was great. The Miami Heat, when Alonzo Mourning was on the Miami Heat, and there were great rivalries. And I just don't see that we have those same rivalries now. And I attribute one part of that to the NBA's failure to sort of market the opponent. We're all focused on our own team, and we know very little about, I know the casual fan in particular knows very little about the other team. But to me, the league really lacks the rivalries. Who are the great rivals right now?
I can't think of it.
It's hard to say.
Right.
And of course, when Stockton and Malone played, you had great rivalry with the Sacramento Kings. There were some great series with the Portland Trailblazers, of course, the Los Angeles Lakers.
The Bulls.
And the Bulls ultimately. Who didn't have a rivalry with the Bulls?
Right.
But right now it's really lacking. I still love the game intensely, but I think that the league needs to do something to try to create more rivalry. And I think that it goes to the heart of getting us to know and enjoy and appreciate the players on the other teams, because it's just maybe I'm just getting old, Alan. I don't mean to start off the show cranky, and maybe it's because they lost.
Yeah, it could be.
But I'm hoping to take my daughter to a playoff game, because there's nothing like an NBA playoff game,
Right.
and there's nothing like an NBA playoff game at that great Delta Center.
Right.
So. There's my basketball pitch for the show. It's always got to be a little bit about basketball. But this is Talk with Ted number 23.
Oh.
Michael Jordan's number, of course. So I'm still talking basketball. And the great LeBron James. And it's the NBA playoffs without LeBron James, which is a real shame. He went to the Lakers. They didn't make the playoffs. I like to think that LeBron is conspiring to do some even greater things after he retires from the game. But it's disappointing that we don't get to see the greatest player of our time right now, LeBron James, in the NBA playoffs. So what does that mean? Donovan Mitchell has got to step it up.
Yeah, he does.
Because Donovan Mitchell is a sensational talent. Last week I had a great show. I had Senator Todd Weiler. I mispronounced his name about 45 times before I got it right. But Todd's a lawyer at the law firm of Christensen and Jensen, back into the private law business, and also a Utah State Senator. And if you missed that show, it was a good one. We opened that show with Troy Brewer from the Salt Lake City Stars. That's the G League affiliate for the Utah Jazz. That play over at the Salt Lake Community College over on Redwood Road. We used to have here the NBA Summer League. Do you remember those days when the NBA Summer League was in Salt Lake City?
I do.
And I'll always remember I saw Dirk Nowitzki, who just retired, the great German killer Dirk Nowitzki. I think he finished now 4th or 5th on the all-time scoring list. He's behind only a few people, including, of course, Karl Malone. But it's a shame that we don't have the Summer League here anymore. But the G League is, sort of the NBA minor league, and Troy Brewer explained to us that even Grayson Allen played in the G League for a period of time this year. And so in addition to the Jazz, you can go over and watch what they're done for the season now. But the NBA G League has got some great talent, and for sure next year I'm going to take my daughter to a bunch of those games. Troy was explaining real family-friendly environment with face painting and all kinds of great stuff. So go Jazz. It's our only major professional sport in town. There's nothing like the NBA playoffs, and if they lose in the first round, I'm going to be heartbroken. So I got to chew them out a little bit more. Dive for the ball.
Yeah.
Dive for the ball. And play recklessly but in control. They looked throwing the ball away the other day. They didn't look too great. Aside from that, what are we dealing with here in Utah? Rain. More rain than I can remember. I've been here 22 years. It won't stop raining. But I just heard on the way over that the temperature in March was quite a bit warmer, the average temperature, than it was in 1984 when Utah and Salt Lake City experienced the great flood that engulfed downtown. So the snow's been melting more judiciously than it did way back then. So maybe we won't have a major flood, but you got to worry about that when there's so much moisture, the ground is so saturated, and there's so much snow still up in the mountains.
There's a lot.
The good news, according to the weather report, sunshine tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
Now, they didn't predict rain today, and we got it all day long, but sunshine tomorrow. So hopefully we'll start to move into some better weather. Of course, we've got Easter coming up on Sunday, and the sun's got to be out for Easter.
Always needs to.
But it's a beautiful time of year where the trees are blooming. We've got cherry trees. I've got a couple of pear trees and an apple tree in the front yard, and there's nothing quite like spring. If it would get here.
Yeah.
Right?
It's hard to enjoy.
It is hard to enjoy. Some other disappointing sports outcomes for me over the weekend. Our local golf hero, legend Tony Finau, played in the final group of the Masters. He was doing wonderfully, and he actually played alongside Tiger Woods. And many people know that Tiger Woods, after a 11-year drought in winning a major championship, heroically went on to win the Masters on Sunday, and that was great to see. No matter what you feel about Tiger Woods, I think everybody is entitled to some redemption and some forgiveness, and it was really nice to see him win. I would have preferred to see Tony Finau win, but Tony's got more opportunities coming, and I'm confident that Tony's going to land in Utah out at that airport with a gigantic trophy in his hand one day, and I'm going to be one of the people there that's outside the airport ready to greet him and congratulate him. So he lost, so I was able to stay out of the rain for that for his return to Utah this time around. Today's show, I had advertised that as let's talk about the United States Constitution. And we're going to do that a bit. Mark Shurtleff and I do a program on Thursday called Common Ground, and Mark's not going to be available on Thursday. So this is going to be sort of a double episode of Talk with Ted. And we're going to talk some constitutional issues today, mostly the First Amendment once we get to it. But we're going to be talking about political correctness. Political correctness kind of came up when I was in college in the 80s. And a lot of people think it's been taken to the extreme and that it doesn't help facilitate free speech, but actually crushes it and kind of taking the debate out of debate. And I have a real problem with political correctness because while it's good in its most basic sense in that we don't we treat each other with respect, don't call each other, awful things, bad names, racist things, etc. It can be taken to an extreme, and I think it has a chilling effect on free speech. And we see it particularly in colleges and safe zones where people feel threatened about opinions that they may have or don't want to be involved in debates. And I think that it's a real problem because there's one thing to, be peaceful and be a pacifist and hope that or try to avoid, confrontation and certainly violence. But there's also some truth to the fact that from conflict comes growth. And I'm just fearful that there's no more conflict. It's either it's my opinion, that's the way it goes. It's sort of the cultural norm, and if you deviate from that cultural norm, you get a bit vilified. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about political correctness today. We're also going to be talking about the Unabomber Manifesto and Ted Kaczynski. So we're coming up on our first commercial break. There's been a few notorious Teds here in Utah over the years. There was Ted Bundy, Ted Kaczynski, and that's it.
Ted McBride.
No, not Ted McBride. I won't be notorious, but hopefully it'll be a little bit informative, and we've got a good show. I'm going to read a bunch of provisions from the Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber Manifesto and see what it looks like 25 years later. I'll be right back. Welcome back to Talk with Ted, number 23. Let's talk about the United States Constitution. And as I got preparing for the show, it kind of got modified a little bit, but we will be talking about the Constitution today, particularly the First Amendment. And on Thursday, I'm going to be talking about a couple of probably some of the most highly debated or talked about cases in U.S. constitutional history. That's Roe versus Wade, which legalized a woman's right to have an abortion back in 1972, as well as, I can't pronounce this one very well, Obergefell versus Hodges, which is the gay marriage case.
Right.
And I represent Alan Anderson, who's here with me right now in connection with claims related to sober living homes. And if you've heard me before, we've talked about it a number of times, but we're relying on those cases, those lines of cases under the First Amendment right of association to claim that residents of sober living homes have a constitutional right to reside in homes with other people in recovery. And that's going to be an interesting show. A couple of weeks ago, I did a show with Troy Rawlings, the Davis County District Attorney, and Troy was the prosecutor on the Mark Shurtleff case and ultimately dismissed those charges against Mark Shurtleff. And of course, Mark was our 3-term former Utah Attorney General. He served from 2000 until 2012, and he'll be in Florida working on a big class action that he's got. He's taking on insurance companies on behalf of auto repair shops who are trying to micromanage the quality of repairs that can be made to vehicles following accidents by using secondhand parts, etc. And so Mark is tied up in a big one there, preparing, I think, for another hearing that he's got. But Mark is a busy, busy man. And I know just this past weekend he was in Oregon at a party for his daughter, an engagement party for his daughter. So his daughter Danielle, who was on our show, a couple of months ago now, has been engaged, and Mark was up there with the party, so I haven't seen him in a bit. But I think that Mr. Shurtleff is enjoying a better life than he did between 2014 and 2016. And Troy Rawlings, the prosecutor, came on and gave us quite a bit of details about that case, but we didn't get into the 7 counts of bribery, accepting gifts, illegal campaign donations. And I am going to pull up the complaint during a break and explain 1 or 2 of those scenarios so that people can understand it a little bit more, because what happened to Mark Shurtleff was really terrible. And the press, the coverage of it was conclusory at best. There were very few details, and the conclusions were that he was guilty.
Right.
And he is not guilty.
No.
He did absolutely nothing wrong. Every one of those charges were false and baseless. And in essence, what happened in his case was that a couple of disgruntled people that Mark had prosecuted, either them or friends or family of them, fabricated a few things, and the prosecutors ran with it, and the investigators in particular. And a remarkable thing happened on that case where there was the FBI cross-deputized a state agent and made him a federal agent for the purposes of that case. And I won't name his name. But then the Department of Justice actually passed on prosecuting that case. Think about that for a second. So you've got the FBI, they bring in a local state agent. The Department of Justice then won't prosecute the case. They bring it to the Salt Lake County attorney who did prosecute the case. And then Troy Rawlings discussed at length the difficulty he had with the investigative agency, that being the FBI, in obtaining information, a lot of information about those complaining witnesses that Mark and his lawyers were entitled to. And Troy Rawlings actually had to file a motion to compel against the United States, against the FBI, to try to get them to turn over what's called Brady material, potentially exonerating material. And then ultimately that case was dismissed. But we didn't talk too much about the actual charges, and I will bring up one or two of those. But that episode is on my LinkedIn page. It's also on my Facebook page. You can find me at Ted McBride on both of those social media forums. Feel free to reach out and friend me. My list of friends is growing. I got a great one this morning, Alan.
Oh, who is it?
I woke up to Lionel Hollins, NBA legend, all-star NBA champion. And I've, because we did that show about Russell Westbrook and the incident with the Utah Jazz fans a few weeks ago, I've shared that with a number of people in the NBA, and it's had thousands of views. And hopefully that will help Utah and the Utah Jazz to point out that it was an isolated incident, as well as the great efforts that the organization is making to ensure that that doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
But you got to just love the NBA, and you've got to love even the energy that the fans bring, the heckling, the screaming, the rallying. It's wonderful, but it can't cross the line. But now one thing did happen in that case that kind of relates a little bit to today. And political correctness, because you could make an argument that the statement that fan was alleged to have made, it was, Russell, get on your knees where you belong. And then they went to his social media pages and found some other posts that may have been directly racist. But the statement that he made, whether it was racist or not, I think is debatable. I'm not justifying it, but I'm just saying we're very quick to jump to certain conclusions on things. If somebody makes a derogatory statement toward an African American man, it's easy to say, oh, well, that's racist, even if the statement itself didn't directly contain any racial connotations. And I think that this goes in part to the problems with being politically correct. And one of the main problems I have with political correctness, and it's not going to the substance of it, because there are certainly many things that shouldn't be said, and we should treat each other with respect. And if you're going to define political correctness as that, I'm all for it. But it can go a little too far where we want to then vilify people, and people can't even make a mistake. So if you would make one statement, you're going to be labeled a racist forever. I'll give an example with respect to President Trump. He had an incident with his real estate company some 30 or 40 years ago where he was fined, I believe, by, it might have been the Justice Department or the Housing Commission, relating to homes being available for poor people, many of whom were black, and he, African American, there I go. Is that a violation? And that was a long time ago. And then many people want to point to that and say, look, he's a racist. He's a racist. And, you know, the definition of being a racist is that you think that one group is physically, mentally, culturally superior to another. And just because he had that one incident where maybe they made some business decisions, probably based on money, I'm not completely familiar with the details of it, but I think it's dangerous to then say he is forever a racist, because I think one of the problems with political correctness is that it becomes very divisive, and we want to put these labels on people and condemn them. And at times condemn them for all eternity. I've heard stories about people in college that are afraid to speak because they're afraid to say the wrong thing.
Right.
And if somebody does speak and says something that's not popular, they can then be ostracized and outcast, and then, you know, don't hang out with that person because that person is a racist. Yeah. And I think that political correctness, correctiveness, what I was going to say, is has really gone too far. This show I call Talk with Ted, a show about nothing. And if I did that as a joke because I'm a giant Seinfeld fan. I love the Seinfeld programs. I think there are about 105 episodes. It ran for 9 years.
They're all great.
I still remember in 1990, I was in law school. I saw the first episode where George, the crazy George, had taken homeopathic medicine because it cost too much to get his hernia or his tonsils out by regular means. And so he met with some guru and ingested some sort of homeopathic thing and ended up in the back of an ambulance, and he was the color of eggplant, going crazy, and the ambulance guys were fighting, and it was a really clever and funny show. And back at that time, that show really kind of pushed the envelope because things were much more conservative. You know, the great sitcom before Seinfeld was Cheers.
Right.
The bar with Ted Danson, the former Major League pitcher who ran the bar. And of course, go back further, you know, we've got Happy Days, All in the Family, I Love Lucy, great shows. But Seinfeld kind of pushed the edge, and they did programs about homosexual relationships, about promiscuity. And really, the essence of that program, it was really kind of real. You know, you've got the four characters. You've got Jerry, George, Elaine, and Kramer. And they weren't model people. They weren't. They were selfish. They were self-centered. They were rude. They were crass. And they kind of didn't care.
Right.
And at the very last episode of that, it was a two-part episode, and it was part genius, part not quite as funny as some of the others. But Jerry had finally landed a contract with NBC to make a show about nothing. And that's where I get my title from. And they were on a trip. They were going to go to Europe, and their plane experienced some problems, and they landed in Boston emergently, and then they were out on the street, and they had witnessed the heavyset gentleman being harassed and beat up by someone, and they stood by and laughed, and they didn't do anything. They didn't intervene. And sort of in their classic Seinfeld characters, they weren't model people. Maybe in some sense they were real people,
right?
But they weren't model people, and they certainly didn't live up to all of the politically correct standards. And there had been in the show, there'd been a Good Samaritan law passed where in that state at that time, if you saw someone in distress, you had an obligation to do something about it. And so they were on trial. In the great final episodes, they brought in all of the people from the past episodes that they had so viciously offended over the 8 or 9 years. And they relived just how awful they were. And they ultimately ended up in jail. Now, my first guest on this program was Professor Amos Giora, a law professor up at the University of Utah, and his parents were Holocaust survivors, and he is pushing for a 911 bill, different from a Good Samaritan bill, where it's not necessary to intervene in any kind of altercation or a situation where you see someone in distress. But under his bill, he's asking, or that bill is calling for, in this day and age where we all have cell phones, to make a 911 call to satisfy that obligation to try to help someone in distress. And I am very much in support of that bill, and we had him on. I think it did not pass last year. Hopefully it will pass this year. I think it's gotten out of committee. I need to reach out to him to get a status on that, and maybe we'll get him back on. But it was just sort of a coincidence that I had him on first, and the Seinfeld show was built around that so much. But now I've seen every Seinfeld episode at least 20 times.
Wow.
At least 20 times. It shows you what kind of life I have.
Oh, billable hours.
Not quite. Not quite. I wish I'd be a rich man. But it's on, 10:30 at night, and I'd watch the news, and then I'd watch an episode of Seinfeld, click the TV off, and go to bed. And now that show is coming up on 30 years since it first came on, and it went off the air, I think, in about 1998, 1999, so it's been off the air for 20 years. And Jerry Seinfeld, he's still a comedian, still goes around, and I don't believe that he does shows any longer on college campuses because of political correctness, and people are offended by his programs and by his humor. And I think that's where political correctness has just gone way, way too far. And there's actually, I've got an article here from just this past December. These 13 jokes from Seinfeld are super offensive now. Yes, that includes the soup Nazi. That's the name of this article. And I really take issue with this, that they're super offensive. The soup Nazi episode, if you're not a big Seinfeld fan, the soup Nazi episode involved a gentleman that opened a soup kitchen in New York City. And the soup was so good that the people were lined up around the corner to get it. And he was a very strict man, and you had to order it in a certain way. And if you didn't order it exactly according to the rules, no soup for you.
No soup.
No soup for you. And very funny. And now with political correctness, it's saying that there's nothing funny about calling someone a Nazi or using that term. That man wasn't doing anything. There was no violence in it. There wasn't anything at all that resembled Nazism other than his sort of strictness, and if you didn't abide by those particular rules, you weren't getting any soup. Right. And of course, George did it wrong and asked for more bread and got the soup yanked away from him. But that's how far we've come with political correctness, that the great Seinfeld show is now considered by some to be off limits and offensive, and Jerry Seinfeld, perhaps the greatest comedian of all time, won't perform on college campuses.
Wow.
I think that's wrong.
Yeah.
And when I come back, we're going to talk about the Unabomber. Talk with Ted. I'll be right back. Welcome back to Talk with Ted, a show about nothing. Today talking First Amendment and political correctness. I've got another political correctness story to tell before we get to the Unabomber Manifesto. I pulled an article just from a few weeks ago. Headline: University of Chicago defends the academic freedom of constitutional law professor who used N-word in class. And this is a really fascinating story because it's kind of a little twist. We've got a long-term professor, law professor Jeffrey Stone, a prominent advocate of free speech, and he's teaching constitutional law, and he's teaching the exception to the First Amendment protections, or a limitation on First Amendment protections, because, of course, we've got all of these constitutional protections, but they're not without limits.
Right.
And the Constitution is very vague. Freedom of speech, what does that mean? And it takes some interpretation and some time and some context to figure out exactly what that means. Our United States Constitution is a great document that's now survived for 240-something years. Do you know how long Thomas Jefferson says a Constitution can last?
I don't.
Roughly?
How long?
20 years.
Really?
And do you know why that is?
No.
Because the Constitution is for the living, not the dead. And there are many constitutions. It takes approximately 10 years for a country to draft a constitution. Myanmar, former Burma, took them 17 years. After the French Revolution, the original constitution in France, it lasted 1 year. But it's a document that needs to evolve with time in order for it to remain relevant. But ours has lasted in this great experiment that we have, this representative democracy that we have. it's lasted some 240 something years, which is amazing. And there's great debate over it. And I'm going to, on Thursday, I'm going to explain why I think Roe versus Wade was one of the worst decisions in constitutional law, not because of the substance of it, and only because of its the divisiveness that it has and the influence that it has on national politics and national elections. And the federal government, is principally responsible for national defense, right?
Right.
Some other things, and this issue, which people have very strong feelings about, and please don't send the hate mail to me. I'm only talking about the procedure, and I think in an ideal world we'd have that same protection on a state by state basis, and in every state. I am for Roe versus Wade for practical reasons. I think that it must exist. Otherwise, it would just be devastating effects for women and back alley abortions and some terrible things. But I hate to see it being the driving force in national politics, and it becomes the issue when we've got so many other things to deal with, the environment, taxes, national security, defense. And I think that it just polarizes us at a national level in a way that hurts our national politics. And of course, then it plays a role into foreign policy and it just into other things. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to go over that decision in some detail and explain how it was a bit of a novel decision. And then the gay marriage decision and the line of cases that led up to that. So that's going to be an interesting show. But back to our professor at the University of Chicago. So there is an exception, and again, it's in the realm of this politically correct. It wasn't that it was politically correct that motivates the hate exception, or now I'm drawing a blank. But it's in the vein that, you can't yell fire in a movie theater.
Right.
And in the same way, you can't incite people and with incredibly offensive, inflammatory language and claim that you have a right to do that under the First Amendment. And so this professor, law professor Jeffrey Stone, used the N-word in his class to illustrate this fact. And some of the students complained, and in order for me to get this right, I'm just going to read some of this article so that I'm fairly accurate. So, law professor Jeffrey Stone, a prominent advocate of free speech, recently came under fire for using the slur as part of an instructional tool in his Constitutional Law 2 Freedom of Speech class, which he has taught for decades. He's also used the antidote for decades. Faculty member, the institution then said this: faculty members have broad freedom in the choice of ideas to discuss in the classroom and their expression of those ideas, and students are free to express their views on those subjects. The University of Chicago is deeply committed to the values of academic freedom and the free expression of ideas, and to fostering a diverse and inclusive climate on campus. We believe universities have an important role as places where controversial ideas can be proposed, tested, debated by faculty and students. So the university supported him, okay?
Right.
And there's some debate now that the universities are catering too much to the students, okay? So here the university supported him. That sounds good, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think that it's good that we have these debates and we illustrated that this was a term that fired people up, and it kind of made the point about why it's not protected. Back to the article. Stone has written 2 books on free speech and is perhaps best known for having chaired a committee for the university several years ago that helped to establish the institution's sweeping Stone Report, which affirmed its zero tolerance policy on restricting speech. And I think this is great. The University of Chicago, one of the best institutions in the country, is recognizing that the political correctness is just chilling debate.
Right.
Back to the article. At issue is Stone's longtime tradition of telling an anecdote in class to teach about the modern relevance of the fighting words exemption to the First Amendment, that being words that seek to incite the infliction of injury or immediate violence, as established in Chaplinsky versus the state of New Hampshire. Quote, campus censors frequently cite the fighting words exemption to legally justify policies that prohibit offensive or indecent language, even though subsequent case law has effectively invalidated this portion of Chaplinsky's holding, according to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, a free speech advocacy group. So what they're saying there is that the institutions, not the University of Chicago in this instance, but other institutions trying to control and regulate language by pointing to this exemption, the fighting words exemption, and using that as a tool or a legal basis to then limit the language that can be used.
Right.
Now, of course, we're talking about the N-word here, but of course it could be applied to many things. Back to the article. This does not mean that the fighting words doctrine is no longer a subject for debate, as it was employed as recently as 2011 by Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, who utilized it in his dissent against the legality of the Westboro Baptist Church's inflammatory speech. So, the school favored the professor. Okay? The professor, well, let me read two or three more paragraphs here, and then I'm going to comment on it. Okay. Stone apologized for what he has said and said, or I'm sorry, this is from a student. A student then who was complaining. I also urge the leadership of the law school to immediately issue a statement that A, explicitly states what our values are, B, explicitly commits to revoking President Stone's teaching privileges if he continues to speak the N-word inside or outside the classroom, and C, explicitly provides timelines for when it will complete all of the diversity committee's recommendations, wrote a law student who's enrolled at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. He then explained, Professor Stone had asked a Mr. Green, who happened to be black, what he thought of the fighting words doctrine. Mr. Green had said that he felt the doctrine was no longer relevant. The professor then had asked a white student in an adjacent row what he thought of Green's argument. The white student had said, that's the dumbest argument I've ever heard, you stupid N-word. So then a student then repeated it. Green had then immediately lunged forward, attempting to choke the white student. So wow. The use of the word certainly illustrated the point, but I don't think it was the professor's word. It was the student that right. that said it. The gentleman that wrote the letter calling for Professor Stone's resignation then said, upon finishing his story, the professor flashed a grin as he saw many of our shocked faces. But a professor doesn't have to use the actual N-word to explain to students why that word could incite violence. We already get it. And at any point he tried to make was completely obscured because both his story and act of retelling it were racist. Okay? That goes back to my earlier point. Was it racist? Where he's using that word to illustrate that it incites violence. I think that the student who repeated it, saying that's the dumbest argument I've ever heard, you stupid N-word, that's certainly a racist comment. Right. But the professor using it, was that racist? Okay? The student complaining said that it's affected his academic performance. He has trouble focusing and participating in the class. Initially, when asked for comment, Professor Stone stood firm. I've been using the story, which is true, for several decades, he told to demonstrate that if the fighting words doctrine has any continuing logic, it is with respect to the use of that uniquely hateful epithet. In a course on the First Amendment, it is essential to identify and to confront the very speech that defines the limits of free expression. I agree with that final sentence of his, that it's essential to identify and confront the very speech that defines the limits of free expression. If you're going to talk about what's outlawed, then you need to sort of use that term.
Right.
And really, is there much of a difference in a professor saying the N-word or using the term? The N-word is watered down. That's what I'm doing right now. It's watered down. On a side note, I said a few weeks ago in discussing this issue, I think it's important for the African-American community to stop using that term affectionately toward one another, because that just creates more of a problem and difficult standards on how some people can use it in some contexts, but others can't. But here's the issue that I have with this story. So we've got the professor uses the term, student complains. The university supports the professor. The professor then met with students. And then this is what he did. He reversed his position after meeting with the students. Quote, I had a very thoughtful conversation with a group of African-American students yesterday, and they gave me a much clearer sense of how hurtful, upsetting, and distracting they find the use of the word, even when it is not used in a manner meant to be insulting or demeaning. He told the Hyde Park Herald. I was very impressed by the depth of their feelings and reactions, and decided that, with that insight, I wouldn't use the anecdote in class going forward. In the end, I decided that the benefit of using the story is outweighed by the costs of doing so. So I'm disappointed with that final response. I was impressed that the University of Chicago had originally supported the professor, but then when he met with the students, it was, again, the students that were able to get him to change what he's been doing, what he's been teaching for decades. And again, I understand that people are offended, but even when the word is used in a manner not meant to be insulting or demeaning, and he still can't use it, that, I think, illustrates the problem with political correctness. And after the national news break here, we're going to come back and talk about the Unabomber and how he relates to political correctness. Welcome back to Hour 2 of Talk with Ted, number 23. Let's talk about the U.S. Constitution. I don't have a guest today. Last week was easy. I had Senator Weiler on. The week before that was even easier. I had Troy Rawlings on. He was like a wind-up doll. I could have said, Troy, just go.
He's great.
The show's a little more challenging when I don't have a guest, but I've got some materials prepared. I'm going to read some things here. Hopefully, I won't tune too many people out. It's now drive time. It looks like the rain has let up a little bit. It was brutal this morning. The road was the water accumulating on the road. Some cars hydroplaning. It's dangerous out there. A lot of traffic on the road, so I always like to give a pitch about driving safely. Speaking of driving, I'm a personal injury and civil rights lawyer here in Salt Lake City. I've got an office down in the Washington Federal Building on the same block as the Matheson Courthouse, and share some space with Mark Shurtleff, and we're hoping that Sky Lazaro, who I had on last month, will be joining us. So we might be setting up a new law firm in the next few weeks, and we'll keep you up to speed on that. But I'm talking about political correctness, the Unabomber, the First Amendment. And before I get to that, we had Bernie Sanders had a town hall meeting yesterday. And Bernie Sanders from Vermont, I went to law school in Vermont. I'm pretty well acquainted with, not personally, but with Bernie Sanders. And he disclosed some of his tax returns yesterday. And I recall the last election, he was more or less claiming that he didn't have a lot of assets. And I think that if you got a chance to look at his tax returns, those tax returns belie that assertion. And so I have a bit of a problem with Bernie Sanders and socialism at large. And I don't think that it's the answer for us. And I think that if Bernie Sanders runs for president, it may very well solidify President Trump's reelection. It reminds me of Ross Perot running in the election. I think it was with Bill Clinton and George Bush. And Ross Perot was able to take some conservative votes, which helped Bill Clinton. And I think that Bernie Sanders, I think the Democrats got to be going crazy if Bernie Sanders is going to run as an independent, because that's going to make their chances of reclaiming the White House that much harder. But my problems with socialism, I can remember in college, I studied political science. And when I first learned about Karl Marx and socialism, I thought that it was, as a 18, 19-year-old kid, I thought it was more morally just than what I saw in college, with a whole lot of rich kids and a lot of people with a whole lot of money, and of course a lot of other people, many more people with no money. But I think that Bernie Sanders solidified himself last night as a one percenter. He's got some assets. He's not a poor man, and I think that socialism kind of runs a little bit counter to human nature and even human happiness, because it's not just a matter of dividing the resources, because we need to figure out ways to divide the resources. And we have social programs in the United States and under our capitalist system to do that. But I think it has more to do with our purpose here and the great value of work. And I live in Utah, which is dominated less so than it used to be by a particular religion. And the Joseph Smith, the founder of that religion, was very much a believer in hard work. And he was murdered when he was 38 years old. And he had accomplished an awful lot. I think he was 38 or 39 years old. And he really understood the value of work and how it can be fulfilling. Work is a very fulfilling thing. It can give us meaning. And of course, we live here in Utah. It's the beehive state, and it's a very industrious place. And there's a lot of hard workers here and a lot of loyal workers. And I think that's why so many companies are moving to Utah, the Fortune 500 companies. And we've got Silicon Slopes. And in addition to the great natural resources that we have in this place, we've got great human resources and people that really understand the value of work. And my main problem with socialism is that I think that it kind of caters to that lazier side of humanity. And people dream about, winning the lottery and having a life of luxury. But we see so many instances where people aren't happy after winning the lottery, and money's not everything. And so I am not a socialist, although I do believe in some social programs, and I do believe that there needs to be some efforts to redistribute the wealth, because if the gap between the rich and the poor gets too great, inevitably there's conflict. That's what leads to revolution. So these are not my final or complete thoughts on these subjects, but Bernie Sanders, I think, is not the answer for the United States or for the Democratic Party. I think they've got to just be pulling their hair out that he's thinking of running again. But we're going to talk now about the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. And Ted Kaczynski was a very brilliant man. He's in prison. I'm not sure if he's in Montana. He's a pen pal to many people. You can communicate with Ted Kaczynski. Right back to you. I do not intend on doing that. And for those that are too young to recall or too much time has passed to remember, the Unabomber created terror over the course of about 20 years. And he mailed, I want to say 19 packages. Was it 16 or 19? But he made bombs. And he targeted scientists. And there was a man in Utah, Wright, I want to say Daniel Wright. He passed away in 2014, who was targeted and suffered very severe neurological damage to his arms as a result of the bomb. Ted Kaczynski killed 3 people and injured many others. And I do not condone anything that he did, and I'm not going to be talking about the revolution that he tried to inspire, because he was very much against technology and blamed a lot of social problems and psychological problems that modern human beings are suffering from as a result of technology. And I by no means am endorsing him, and we're not going to talk about the bombing or the pain that he caused. But in 1995, he wrote a manifesto, 35,000-page essay, or 35,000 word, 35,000 page, 35,000 word essay, and he sent it to the New York Times and the Washington Post and demanded that they print it on the front page, and he threatened more terrorist attacks, more bombings. He was a domestic terrorist, if in fact they didn't publish it. And by that point in time, the FBI had been looking for him for more than 20 years. And they collectively got together with those newspapers, and they made the decision to publish it. He was discovered shortly thereafter because his brother and his wife they read the manifesto, and they recognized some of the terms and the language and the writing style, and they tipped off the FBI. And most of you know the rest of the story. They tracked him down in a cabin in Montana where he was living without electricity and without water, and he looked like a caveman. And they arrested him, thank goodness, and that was the end of his reign of terror. But Ted Kaczynski was a brilliant man. I don't know what he's like now. When I say brilliant, intellectually brilliant. He had an IQ equivalent to Einstein and Stephen Hawking's, and he was a brilliant mathematician and a professor himself. And in 1969, he abandoned his academic career. He was apparently a bit of an oddball. I think he went to Harvard. They interviewed some of his classmates and roommates, and he was a odd, strange guy. But in 1969, he abandoned his career and he moved to Montana to a cabin, not the one where he was ultimately apprehended in. But he taught himself, or began to teach himself, how to live in nature, how to hunt, how to be self-sufficient. Shortly after that, within a few years, there was development in that area, and he grew more angry, more convinced that the modern technological world was detaching human beings from nature and would ultimately lead to great conflict, downfall, human suffering, including acute suffering in the third world. And so he started a bombing campaign in 1978 that went from 1978 to 1995. And it was 16 bombs, including, I think, one on an airplane. He tried to blow up an airplane. That one sort of malfunctioned. I think there was one person that was treated for some smoke insulation, but 16 people entered. But the guy was an absolute menace. And it was the most expensive criminal investigation in the history of the FBI. I don't know what it cost to track down bin Laden, but as far as somebody domestically here, it took them 20 years to track this guy down. Compare that to Timothy McVeigh, who was responsible for blowing up the building in Oklahoma City, and he got pulled over on his way out of town. It didn't take them very long at all to catch him, because of course he was driving a car with no license plates. Oh. That's how he got caught. But it was in 1971 that Ted Kaczynski moved to a cabin near Lincoln, Montana. Again, got more and more upset with science and technology, and he wrote a 35,000-word essay called Industrial Society and Its Future. And in it, he's got a couple of themes, and he basically was saying that technology was destabilizing society, making life unfulfilling, and leading to psychological suffering. And he was trying to inspire a revolution against technology. I think we can say 25 years later, he's failed at that, because we certainly have plenty of that technology now. But he wrote this manifesto essentially the year the internet was created, the year Al Gore invented the internet. I say that tongue in cheek. But I'm going to read some things that might get slightly boring. I've got 1 minute to go, so I'm gonna read some quotes when I get back. But he's basically got a couple of themes, and one is that for human evolution. Basically 10,000 years until the 1850s with the Industrial Revolution, people lived in extended families and small communities, and they lived rurally and were more or less self-sufficient. And even though they suffered great problems and challenges, wild animals, how to grow your food, they were more or less in control in dealing with those threats and problems that existed. And one of Ted Kaczynski's big
theme.
Thank you. With the Industrial Revolution is that we're now no longer in control of fighting those things off.
Right.
And that also that we have a whole new host of problems as a result of those technologies. And so when I come back after this break, I'm gonna read some paragraphs to you that deal with basically the psychology of his thoughts on psychology and the effect on humans as a result of the Industrial Revolution and technology. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk with Ted. It's 5:23 on April 16th. Do you know what today is, Alan?
What?
It's National Eggs Benedict Day.
Really?
Go figure.
I gotta go get some.
That's what they're telling us on KSL Radio News. So hopefully we've got something more substantive here than National Eggs Benedict Day. And hopefully everybody got their taxes filed yesterday. I did mine. I had a little bit of a refund thanks to President Trump and his tax plan, and I am not a 1%er, and I am not afraid to say that I was pleased with the outcome of my tax return and the refund that I'll be getting. And I can now choose what I want to do with that money instead of give it to the federal government, who in large part will waste it. But I'm talking about constitutional law, the First Amendment. I'll be back on Thursday to talk a little more substance about the Bill of Rights and take you through the Bill of Rights and litigation that's going on, the First Amendment, the right of assembly, the right of association, the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, due process. So we'll get into that on Thursday, as well as a little more detail on the fighting words doctrine that I spoke about earlier. But right now we're talking the Unabomber, and it's 35,000 words. I'm not going to attempt to read all of them. I think it'd take about 3 hours. But he's got a couple of themes. And first the introduction, then I'll tell you a couple of his themes. So this is from the cover of the New York Times in 1995. Paragraph 1. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. They have greatly increased the life expectancy of those of us who live in, quote, advanced countries, but they have destabilized society, have made life unfulfilling, have subjected human beings to indignities, have led to widespread psychological suffering, parentheses, in the third world to physical suffering as well, end parentheses, and have inflicted severe damage on the natural world. The continued development of technology will worsen the situation. It will certainly subject human beings to greater indignities and inflict greater damage on the natural world. It will probably lead to greater social disruption and psychological suffering, and it may lead to increased physical suffering even in advanced countries. I'm going to pause right there and just do a little ad lib. A month or two ago, I did a show talking about transhumanism and artificial intelligence, and it was when Sky Lazaro was on the program. And, you know, we talk about artificial intelligence and leading to a world where maybe none of us have to work.
Right.
And doesn't that sound like a dream? Maybe it'd be a nightmare.
Yeah.
And I worry about two things. One, the disruptive effect to get there? And then two, is that a dream? Would we be better off if we're all just playing golf all day long and we had machines taking care of everything for us? And so my grandfather was an Irish immigrant, and he didn't like ATM machines because he thought they took jobs away from people. And he was a doorman. He wouldn't like the automated doors either. So not a new issue. But Ted Kaczynski advocated a revolution against the industrial system. Now, part of the first part of his essay is the psychology of modern leftism. And I'm going to read some of this, but I will point out, and I'm going to skip ahead to paragraph 50 after I read about the modern lefts, because he doesn't have nice things to say about conservatives either. So it's not one-sided. Paragraph 6. Almost everyone will agree that we live in a deeply troubled society. One of the most widespread manifestations of the craziness of our world is leftism. So a discussion of the psychology of leftism can serve as an introduction to the discussion of the problems of modern society in general. Paragraph 7. What is leftism? During the first half of the 20th century, leftism could have been practically identified with socialism. Today, the movement is fragmented, and it's not clear who can properly be called a leftist. When we speak of leftists in this article, we have in mind mainly socialists, collectivists, politically correct types, feminists, gay and disability activists, animal rights activists, and the like. But not everyone who is associated with one of these movements is a leftist. What we are trying to get at in discussing leftism is not so much movement or an ideology as a psychological type, or rather a collection of related types. Thus, what we mean by leftism will emerge more clearly in the course of our discussion of leftist psychology. Now, he writes in the plural in we, but it was just him.
Yeah.
Paragraph 8. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip that. Paragraph 9. The two psychological tendencies that underlie modern leftism we call feelings of inferiority and over-socialization. Feelings of inferiority are characteristic of modern leftism as a whole, while over-socialization is characteristic only of a certain segment of modern leftism, but this segment is highly influential. Paragraph 10. By feelings of inferiority, we mean not only inferiority feelings in the strict sense, but a whole spectrum of related traits: low self-esteem, feelings of powerlessness, depressive tendencies, defeatism, guilt, self-hatred, etc. We argue that modern leftists tend to have some such feelings, possibly more or less repressed, and that these feelings are decisive in determining the direction of modern leftism. Paragraph 11. When someone interprets as derogatory almost anything that is said about him or about groups with whom he identifies, we conclude that he has inferiority feelings or low self-esteem. This tendency is pronounced among minority rights activists, whether or not they belong to the minority groups whose rights they defend. They are hypersensitive about the words used to designate minorities and about anything that is said concerning minorities. The terms Negro, Oriental, handicapped, or chick for African, an Asian, a disabled person, or a woman originally had no derogatory connotation. Broad and chick were merely the feminine equivalents of guy, dude, or fellow. The negative connotations have been attached to these terms by the activists themselves. Some animal rights activists have gone so far as to reject the word pet and insist on its replacement by animal companion. Leftist anthropologists go to great lengths to avoid saying anything about primitive peoples that could conceivably be interpreted as negative. They want to replace the word primitive by non-literate. They seem almost paranoid about anything that might suggest that any primitive culture is inferior to our own. Parentheses. We do not mean to imply that primitive cultures are inferior to ours. We merely point out the hypersensitivity of leftist anthropologists. Paragraph 13. Many leftists have an intense identification with the problems of groups that have an image of being weak, parentheses women, defeated, parentheses American Indians, repellent, parentheses, homosexuals, or otherwise inferior. The leftists themselves feel that these groups are inferior. They would never admit to that themselves that they have such feelings, but it is precisely because they do see these groups as inferior that they identify with their problems. Parentheses, we do not mean to suggest that women, Indians, etc. are inferior. We are only making a point about leftist psychology. I'm going to skip ahead to paragraph 21. Leftists may claim that their activism is motivated by compassion or by moral principles, and moral principle does play a role for the leftists of the over-socialized type. But compassion and moral principle cannot be the main motives for leftist activism. Hostility is too prominent a component of leftist behavior. So is the drive for power. Moreover, much leftist behavior is not rationally calculated to be of benefit to the people who the leftists claim to be trying to help. For example, if one believes that affirmative action is good for black people, does it make sense to demand affirmative action in hostile or dogmatic terms? Obviously, it would be more productive to take a diplomatic and conciliatory approach that would make at least verbal and symbolic concessions to white people who think that affirmative action discriminates against them. But leftist activists do not take such an approach because it would not satisfy their emotional needs. Helping black people is not their real goal. Instead, race problems serve as an excuse for them to express their own hostility and frustrated need for power. In doing so, they actually harm black people because the activists' hostile attitude toward the white majority tends to intensify race hatred. 23. We emphasize that the foregoing does not pretend to be an accurate description of everyone who might be considered a leftist. It is only a rough indication of a general tendency of leftism. Now I'm just going to skip ahead to paragraph 50, because we're talking about the leftists there. In paragraph 50, under where he's talking about sources of social problems, it says, the conservatives are fools. They whine about the decay of traditional values, yet they enthusiastically support technological progress and economic growth. Apparently, it never occurs to them that you can't make rapid, drastic changes in the technology and the economy of a society without causing rapid changes in all other aspects of the society as well, and that rapid changes inevitably break down traditional values. Now let me back up. I know I'm jumping around and I'm not going to be able to do this justice, but I've read this through. It's a pretty easy read. He doesn't use a lot of terms that you don't understand, but I think that it's interesting, especially in our technological age, on the brink of artificial intelligence and this dream of pure equality and not having to work, and in this environment of political correctness. I think that this man's writings are thought-provoking, and that's why I'm reading it. After his next category is over-socialization. Paragraph 24. Psychologists use the term socialization to designate the process by which children are trained to think and act as society demands. A person is said to be well socialized if he believes in and obeys the moral code of his society and fits in well as a functioning part of that society. It may seem senseless to say that many leftists are over-socialized, since the leftist is perceived as a rebel. Nevertheless, the position can be defended. Many leftists are not such rebels as they seem. Paragraph 25. The moral code of our society is so demanding that no one can think, feel, and act in a completely moral way. For example, we are not supposed to hate anyone, yet almost everyone hates somebody at some time or other, whether he admits it to himself or not. Some people are so highly socialized that the attempt to think, feel, and act morally imposes a severe burden on them. In order to avoid feelings of guilt, they continually have to deceive themselves about their own motives and find moral explanations for feelings and actions that in reality have a non-moral origin. We use the term over-socialized to describe such people. Paragraph 26. Over-socialization can lead to low self-esteem, a sense of powerlessness, defeatism, guilt, etc. One of the most important means by which our society socializes children is by making them feel ashamed of behavior or speech that is contrary to society's expectations. If this is overdone, or if a particular child is especially susceptible to such feelings, he ends by feeling ashamed of himself. Moreover, the thought and behavior of the over-socialized person are more restricted by society's expectations than those of the lightly socialized person. The majority of people engage in a significant amount of naughty behavior. They lie, they commit petty thefts, they break traffic laws, they goof off at work, they hate someone, they say spiteful things, or they use some underhanded trick to get ahead of the other guy. The over-socialized person cannot do these things, or if he does do them, he generates in himself a sense of shame and self-hatred. The over-socialized person cannot even experience without guilt thoughts or feelings that are contrary to the accepted morality. He cannot think unclean thoughts. And socialization is not just a matter of morality. We are socialized to conform to many norms of behavior that do not fall under the heading of morality. Thus, the over-socialized person is kept on a psychological leash and spends his life running on rails that society has laid down for him. In many over-socialized people, this results in a sense of constraint and powerlessness that can be a severe hardship. We suggest that over-socialization is among the more serious cruelties that human beings inflict on one another. I'm going to take a break right there. We're probably running up on a commercial. Well, no, I can squeeze it another paragraph. Again, I do not agree with everything this man says, but I find this stuff curious. And of course, we need moral code, we need law, we need standards, in large part because human beings can't regulate themselves.
Right.
Paragraph 31. We realize that many objections could be raised to the foregoing thumbnail sketch of leftist psychology. The real situation is complex, and anything like a complete description of what it would take several volumes, even if the necessary data were available. We claim only to have indicated very roughly the two most important tendencies in the psychology of modern leftism. Paragraph 32. The problems of the leftists are indicative of the problems of our society as a whole. Low self-esteem, depressive tendencies, and defeatism are not restricted to the left. Though they are especially noticeable in the left, they are widespread in our society. And today's society tries to socialize us to a greater extent than any previous society. We are even told by experts how to eat, how to exercise, how to make love, how to raise our kids, and so forth. The next section that he goes into is called the power process. And in a nutshell, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber who sits in jail for hurting people, believes that we need goals. We need to exert effort, and that we need to attain those goals in order to live a fulfilling life. The last element of his power process is autonomy, that we need to have some ability to do that ourselves. And he argues in this essay that under the modern system, that's not possible. So interesting stuff, food for thought. We're coming up on a commercial, and I'll be back with the final segment of Talk with Ted. Welcome back to the final segment of Talk with Ted. It's 5:43 on April 16th, 2019. And I've got to throw another disclaimer out there. I'm reading the Unabomber Manifesto, but I am not condoning or anything that this man says or the agenda that he had. But he was a brilliant man that wrote these things. I don't know when he developed all these theories, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and he published this in the New York Times. The New York Times agreed to publish it. The Washington Post agreed to publish it back in 1995. And my show, I've had on Jody Sampson from the Unified Police Department talking about efforts by the Salt Lake Police to arrive at the scene of crimes with counselors. And of course, we've got an epidemic with mass shootings. And I think that I'm hoping that some of this reading will trigger some thoughts on maybe why we're suffering from these problems like we are today, and how mental health needs to be dealt with in a much, much, much more aggressive way in light of the modern world that we live in. So now the power process is the next section of his essay, and I'm really scratching the surface because it's I forget how many paragraphs he has, but I'm only up to paragraph 33. It goes up into the hundreds. I think he's got 140 paragraphs or so. Yeah, 142. The power process. Human beings have a need, probably based on biology, for something that we call the power process. This is closely related to the need for power, which is widely recognized, but is not quite the same thing. The power process has 4 elements. The 3 most clear-cut of these we can call goal, effort, and attainment. Everyone needs to have goals whose attainment require effort and needs to succeed in attaining at least some of his goals. The 4th element is more difficult to define and may not be necessary for everyone. We call it autonomy, and we'll discuss it later. I don't think I'm going to get to that part. Paragraph 34. Consider the hypothetical case of a man who can have anything he wants just by wishing for it. Such a man has power, but he will develop serious psychological problems. At first, he will have a lot of fun, but by and by, he will become acutely bored and demoralized. Eventually, he may become clinically depressed. History shows that leisured aristocracies tend to become decadent. This is not true of fighting aristocracies that have to struggle to maintain their power, but leisured, secure aristocracies that have no need to exert themselves usually become bored, hedonistic, and demoralized, even though they have power. This shows that power is not enough. One must have goals toward which he exercises one's power. Paragraph 35. Everyone has goals, if nothing else, to obtain the physical necessities of life. Food, water, and whatever clothing and shelter are made necessary by the climate. But the leisured aristocrat obtains these things without effort, hence his boredom and demoralization. 36. Non-attainment of important goals results in death if the goals are physical necessities, and in frustration if non-attainment of the goals is compatible with survival. Consistent failure to attain goals throughout life results in defeatism, low self-esteem, or depression. Thus, in order to avoid serious psychological problems, a human being needs goals whose attainment require effort, and he must have a reasonable rate of success in attaining these goals. Now, part of what he's getting at here, and I'm not going to be able to read it, is that, because I just don't have enough time, is that part of the problem with the industrial world that we live in is that some of these goals are too easy to attain and don't even require enough effort. And he says, you learn a trade, you show up to a job on time, you make a reasonable effort, and you're provided with those necessities of life. But he believed that you needed more effort in order to get that personal satisfaction and to have that personal fulfillment. Paragraph 37, thus, in order to avoid serious psychological problems, a human being needs goals whose attainment require effort and must have a reasonable rate of success in attaining those goals. I think I just read that twice. He then goes on in another section, sources of social problems. And so now I'm going to jump ahead to paragraph 68. So keep in mind I'm missing a lot of the information here. It may be objected that primitive man is physically less secure than modern man, as is shown by his shorter life expectancy. Hence, modern man suffers from less, not more, than the amount of insecurity that is normal for human beings. But psychological security does not closely correspond with physical security. What makes us feel secure is not so much objective security as a sense of confidence in our ability to take care of ourselves. Primitive man, threatened by a fierce animal or by hunger, can fight in self-defense or travel in search of food. He has no certainty of success in these efforts, but he is by no means helpless against the things that threaten him. The modern individual, on the other hand, is threatened by many things against which he is helpless: nuclear accidents, carcinogens in food, environmental pollution, war, increasing taxes, invasion of his privacy by large organizations, nationwide social or economic phenomenon that may disrupt his way of life. Paragraph 69. It is true that primitive man is powerless against some of the things that threaten him, disease, for example, but he can accept the risk of disease stoically. It is part of the nature of things. It is no one's fault, unless it is the fault of some imaginary, impersonal demon. But threats to the modern individual tend to be man-made. They are not the results of chance, but are imposed on him by other persons whose decisions he, as an individual, is unable to influence. Consequently, he feels frustrated, humiliated, and angry. Thus, paragraph 70. Thus, the primitive man, for the most part, has his security in his own hands, either as an individual or as a member of a small group, whereas the security of modern man is in the hands of persons or organizations that are too remote or too large for him to be able to personally influence them. So modern man's drive for security tends to fall into groups 1 and 3. In some area, food and shelter. Now, 1 and 3, I skipped ahead a little bit, so we may not know that context. His security is assured at the cost of only trivial effort, whereas the others, he cannot attain security. The foregoing greatly simplifies the real situation, but it does indicate in a rough general way how the condition of modern man differs from that of primitive man. Paragraph 83. Some people partly satisfy their need for power by identifying themselves with a powerful organization or mass movement. An individual lacking goals or power joins a movement or an organization, adopts its goals as his own, then works toward those goals. When some of the goals are attained, the individual, even though his personal efforts have played only an insignificant part in the attainment of the goals, feels, through his identification with the movement or organization, as if he had gone through the power process. This phenomenon was exploited by fascists, Nazis, and communists. Our society uses it too, though less crudely. Example, Manuel Noriega was an irritant to the U.S. The goal was to punish Noriega. The U.S. invaded Panama, effort, and punished Noriega, attainment of the goal. Thus, the U.S. went through the power process, and many Americans, because of their identification with the U.S., experienced the power process vicariously. Hence, the widespread public approval of the Panama invasion, it gave people a sense of power. We see the same phenomenon in armies, corporations, political parties, humanitarian organizations, religious or ideological movements. In particular, leftist movements tend to attract people who are seeking to satisfy their need for power. But for most people, identification with a large organization or mass movement does not fully satisfy the need for power. The next section, motivation of scientists, and I'm going to skip over this, but in this rant, Ted Kaczynski basically hammers all scientists by saying you're not motivated by good, it's only your own curiosity and your attachment to the industrial system. So I'm going to skip over that part. He then goes on to talk about the nature of freedom. And I've got a couple more here, and this is going to segue, if the timing's right, it's going to segue right into Thursday's show. I'm told I've got 3 minutes to go. The nature of freedom, paragraph 93. We are going to argue that industrial technological society cannot be reformed in such a way as to prevent it from progressively narrowing the sphere of human freedom. But because freedom is a word that can be interpreted in many ways, we must first make clear what kind of freedom we are concerned with. By freedom, we mean the opportunity to go through the power process with real goals, not the artificial goals of surrogate activities, and without interference, manipulation, or supervision from anyone, especially from any large organization. I'm going to pause right there. I skipped over a part. The surrogate activities, he's talking about playing golf, watching sporting events, working out, building muscles, turning your body into muscles is a type of power process, but it's a surrogate activity different from the effort and fulfillment that come with establishing and providing for your own survival. Back to the text. Freedom means being in control, either as an individual or as a member of a small group, of the life and death issues of one's existence, food, clothing, shelter, and defense against whatever threats there may be to one's environment. Freedom means having power, not the power to control other people, but the power to control the circumstances of one's own life. One does not have freedom if anyone else, especially a large organization, has power over one, no matter how benevolently, tolerantly, and permissively that power may be exercised. It is important not to confuse freedom with mere permissiveness. Paragraph 96, he talks about constitutional rights. This is probably the last one that I'll be able to read, and then on Thursday, I'll be talking all about constitutional rights. Paragraph 96. As for our constitutional rights, consider, for example, that of freedom of the press. We certainly don't mean to knock that right. It is very important tool for limiting concentration of political power and for keeping those who do have political power in line by publicly exposing any misbehavior on their part. But freedom of the press is of little use to the average citizen as an individual. The mass media are mostly under the control of large organizations that are integrated into the system. Anyone who has a little money can have something printed or can distribute it on the internet or in some such way, but what he has to say will be swamped by the vast volume of material put out by the media. Hence, it will have no practical effect. To make an impression on society with words is therefore almost impossible for most individuals and small groups. Take us, for example. If we had never done anything violent and had submitted the present writings to a publisher, they probably would not have been accepted. If they had been accepted and published, they probably would not have attracted many readers, because it's more fun to watch the entertainment put out by the media than to read a sober essay. Even if these writings had many readers, most of these readers would soon have forgotten what they had read, as their minds were flooded by the mass of materials to which the media exposed them. In order to get our message before the public with some chance of making a lasting impression, we've had to kill people. I'm going to stop right there because that one kind of just left a bad taste in my mouth. This guy's a murderer, a brilliant murderer at that, but a murderer. And so again, I don't condone his actions, but I find his insights on our modern life, human nature, effort that's required, fulfillment in this life, and I do believe in some of his theories about psychological suffering and even the over-socialization. And I think about, the epidemic with mass murders, and we've got, kids going into schools or into movie theaters, shooting everyone up. And I think that this over-socialization may have something to do with that we have standards that people can't live up to, and that leads to those feelings of guilt, of powerlessness, and maybe these things need to be more seriously addressed by the mental health community. Last couple of comments on political correctness. I was reading some articles in preparation for this show where we had college kids afraid to say that they went to church because they didn't think that the group that they were hanging out with, they didn't want to come out as going to church. Somebody in a college class said that's a crazy idea and was reprimanded by a professor who said that stigmatizes mentally disabled people. A woman wearing moccasins was accused of cultural appropriation. And I think that we really need to take a look at political correctness and maybe allow a little more conflict in our discourse while at the same time doing our best to be, as Gail Miller said after the Jazz game where there was the confrontation, we need to be respectful of one another, and that includes being respectful of different ideas. We're up against the commercial. I'll be back. Mark Shurtleff won't be with me on Thursday, but I'm going to recap this very briefly and then talk about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and have a few stories for you on Thursday. Thanks for listening.